Okay. We're going to begin, I guess it's our second full class period talking about the Ramsey Neoclassical Growth Model. In our first session, we spent basically the entire class kind of describing the economic environment and then discussing how the problem that faces the representative family in that environment by itself is not specified well enough in order to generate sensible solutions. In particular, that model by itself, without further constraining it in some way, does not rule out the possibility that the family is going to generate infinite borrowing and run these Ponzi schemes that we talked about. And so two ways of dealing with that type of crazy behavior in the model is by imposing either a natural debt limit or alternatively imposing the no Ponzi game condition directly. And we spent some time talking about what those were and how they are related, in particular, how the no Ponzi constraint is related to the representative family's lifetime budget constraint. Remember, in this model, the trading environment is one in which agents show up every period and work or rent capital, and they receive resources from doing so, and they turn around and purchase consumption goods every single period. It's what's called a sequential trading environment. It is important for the allocations that emerge in that environment to be consistent or equivalent to the ones that would emerge in this so-called Arrow-Debreu equilibrium, where all trades take place in the initial period. What is the constraint that confronts a representative family in an Arrow-Debreu world? It's not a sequential or period by period budget constraint, but rather it is a lifetime budget constraint. So to make sure that the two constraints are compatible with one another, we had to impose this no Ponzi game condition, which was, if you guys recall, it was the limit as t approaches infinity of essentially the present discounted value of the family's asset position, AT, expressed in per worker terms or on a per capita basis. Now, this was a constraint that we imposed on the model, or that we are going to impose on the model, okay? Now, one way we motivated this was we thought about what would happen in a finite horizon model where the end of time occurs at cap t, okay? And we argued that the family's asset position at the beginning of date t, if that's when the world ends, would need to be greater than or equal to 0, right? Financial market participants would not allow families to die with unpaid debt. But if you also think about it, utility in this model depends only on consumption, right? And utility is strictly increasing in consumption. So in what sense is it desirable for the family to have any assets remaining at the end of time? It's not, right? There's no bequest motive in the model. The family would like to exhaust its lifetime resources in order to generate the highest possible stream of consumption, right? And so one of the optimality conditions in a finite horizon model would be one in which the family wants to make sure that it goes into the grave having the family's asset position at exactly equal to 0 at day t, so that the family can maximize its stream of consumption over time, okay? Similarly, in an infinite horizon model, it's going to be optimal. Now, this isn't a constraint, but what we're going to find is it's going to be optimal for the representative family to actually exhaust its lifetime resources. And that means that this no Ponzi game condition is going to hold in strong form, meaning that it holds with equality rather than as an inequality. So let me be clear about this. The no Ponzi constraint is the weak form of the constraint. where the present value of the family's asset position has to be greater than or equal to 0. What we're going to demonstrate today, however, is that if the family is behaving optimally, that in the long run, the family is going to let its asset position asymptotically approach 0 in present value terms. That's the strong form of the no Ponzi condition. The strong form of the no Ponzi condition is very much an optimality condition of this model. The weak form is a constraint that we're imposing on the model up front. Okay, so make sure you understand kind of that distinction. All right, and what we're going to show is that the transversality condition that partly describes the household's optimization problem will imply the strong form of the no Ponzi condition. Okay. All right. If there's no questions about that, let me move now to the third part of this discussion, and that is an actual characterization of the equilibrium. I think this is definition 1 in your lecture slides. So a competitive decentralized equilibrium in this model is going to correspond to a sequence CT, AT, RT, WT, big RT, and KT. That satisfy the following conditions. First off, for a given sequence of factor prices, capital R and W, the firm is behaving optimally. So RT will be equal to F prime of KT, and WT will be equal to F of KT minus KT times F prime of KT. That is, the real rental rate is equal to the marginal product of capital, and the real wage is equal to the marginal product of labor for all T, right? So in other words, given sequences of R's and W's, the firm is behaving optimally. It's choosing its inputs to maximize profits or minimize costs. Also, given this same sequence of factor prices, the representative household is going to maximize over sequences of C's and A's the infinite sum from T is equal to 0 to infinity of 1 plus N over 1 plus rho to the T, that's the discount factor, times period utility, subject to 2 constraints. One is the period by period or flow budget constraint, which says that the change in the family's asset position adjusted for population is equal to RT minus N times AT plus the wage minus consumption. But the other constraint that the family faces, of course, is the weak form of the no Ponzi condition. So the limit as T goes to infinity of AT times the product from J is equal to 0 to T minus 1 of 1 plus N over 1 plus RJ is greater than or equal to 0. Given initial assets, which we know in equilibrium has to be equal to the initial capital stock. And finally, the risk-free rate that the family faces is going to be equal to the net real return to the capital stock, capital R minus the depreciation rate. This is we're going to do a slightly more formal statement of the equilibrium in this model a little bit later today after we actually characterize the household's optimization problem. But I want to give you a sense of what it is up front, okay? It's a sequence of prices, R's and W's, such that the firm is behaving optimally. Which equations characterize firm optimality are the 2 efficiency conditions. Given those same sequences of factor prices, the household has to be behaving optimally as well, meaning that it's choosing its consumption and asset holdings over time to maximize lifetime consumption, subject to the period by period budget constraint and the weak form of the no Ponzi condition. And all markets clear. The market clearing conditions are what determine the prices in equilibrium. And the family's asset position has to be equal to the capital stock. All right, so our statement of a competitive equilibrium describes the optimal behavior of the agents in our economy. There are two types of agents. There are representative families with these continuum of members, and there's also the representative firm. And our concept of equilibrium imposes this equilibrium condition on it, where markets clear and there's perfect competition in a Walrasian sense. You'll notice here that the equilibrium is a dynamic concept, like it always has been since we started talking about the Solow model. Okay, you guys have any questions then about that? Let's spend the better part of today characterizing the representative households maximization problem. Okay, this is the sequence problem that the representative family faces to maximize this lifetime objective function subject to these sequential budget constraints and the no Ponzi condition. All right, how do we do this before? In the context of the optimal growth model, what was our strategy for solving these sequence problems?
We first transform the problem into a functional equation.
You transform the problem into a functional equation. Very good. Okay. So what are the obvious control versus state variables in the family's problem here? The state variable would be the asset position at the beginning of date t, right? The control variables would be consumption and the amount of assets you carry into date t plus 1. So what we typically do is we want to simplify the problem so that we just have one state and one control. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to substitute consumption out of this problem by solving for consumption in the family's period by period budget constraint. So you'll notice here that CT is equal to RT minus N AT plus WT minus AT plus 1 minus AT times 1 plus N. A bunch of this stuff cancels, and you're going to be left with CT is equal to 1 plus RT times AT plus WT minus 1 plus N AT plus 1. Now, let me take a minute here and address a small issue that emerges in this problem compared to what we've seen in the past. The dynamic programming theorems that we've discussed so far apply only to stationary problems, okay? You'll recall that in order to solve them, we need to be able to write the payoff function, the utility function in this case, just as a function of the state variable KT and the control variable KT plus 1, and no other variables. We can have parameters in there, but no other variables, right? What would happen to Boy if we plugged in this value, this term for CT into the utility function? We would have the utility function depend on the state AT and the control AT plus 1. However, we've got these other two time varying terms here, which are the factor prices, okay, which theoretically could be non-stationary, which might make the problem, the dynamic programming problem, non-stationary, okay? there are two ways to address this issue, okay? Now, the way I address it in the lecture notes is not the way I'm going to do it in class. I'm going to take a shortcut in class. The most direct way to address this, that's spelled out in the lecture notes, is that you can modify the theorems to account for potential non-stationarities. Your textbook author does that, and it turns out that you can still establish a set of theorems where you can use dynamic programming just modified to take into account this type of non-stationarity, okay? And it culminates in something like a theorem 8, I believe, where the optimization problem is characterized by the Euler equation and the transversality condition in a very similar way. Alternatively, you could do the following. You could assume that the household recognizes that the factor payments here, WT and RT, are going to be some time invariant functions of the state itself. Okay? That the household is just going to take as given, right? Remember, the household treats the wage and the return to assets as given or as exogenous when solving its own problem. But the household is smart and understands the setup of the economy and realizes that in equilibrium, the wage and the real return to capital are just going to be functions of the state, AT or KT in equilibrium. And they're going to be stationary functions of the state. All right, in that way, we can essentially write the payoff function just as a function then of ATs and AT plus ones and apply our stationary dynamic programming theorems directly. That's what I actually want to do. So there's this long discussion in your lecture notes about these non-stationary theorems. I would encourage you to read that, but I'm not actually going to follow that in class. What I'm going to do is assume that the family knows what these time invariant functions are, but they don't consider how their own asset choice affects what the wage and the return to capital are going to be in equilibrium. It takes it as given, right? There's a ton of families in the economy. And so any single family doesn't think about how its own decision affects the aggregate outcome. That's rational in this atomistic type world, okay? That's the proper concept of equilibrium that we're going to discuss here. Okay, does that make sense? I wanted to take a small digression there to go over that particular point. All right, with that said, we can set up the value function or the Bellman equation for this problem. It's going to be, the Bellman equation would be the value function, which would be a function of the asset position of a family, A, is going to be equal to the max of A prime, which is going to be on some constraint set, which we'll define in a minute, G of A. And the Bellman equation is what? It's the current return plus the continuation return. What is the current return? It's U of C, where C is what? It is 1 plus R, where families recognize that R is a time invariant function of the state. I'm going to write that as R of A times A plus the wage, which is also a stationary time invariant function of the state, minus 1 plus N A prime, plus the discounted continuation return. Now the question is, what does GA look like? GA, in order to apply the dynamic programming theorems, needs to be a compact set, right? And the state variable A needs to lie on a compact set as well. Well, how can we define G to be a compact interval that A must lie on? Well, what is the highest value that A prime or AT plus 1 can take in any given period? It would be the level then at which consumption is 0, right? And when consumption is 0, what is AT plus 1 going to be? It's going to be 1 plus R times A plus W, right, times 1 over 1 plus n. That's the upper bound on what A prime can be in any given period, given the current value of A. What is the lower bound on A prime? Well, not 0, right? Because we aren't imposing that assets are equal to capital at this early stage in the problem. But is there a hard lower bound that we can impose to make this a compact set?
When 18 plus 1 is 0.
Sorry?
Is it when 18 plus 1 is 0? So that whole term is 0?
Well, that's too restrictive because it doesn't allow for the possibility of borrowing in this problem. How about the natural debt limit? Negative W bar. You guys remember what that is? Remember we defined W bar T in the last class as 1 over 1 plus n times the sum from S is equal to 0 to infinity of the product from J is equal to 0 to S of 1 plus n over 1 plus Rj times Wt plus S. That's the present discounted value of lifetime labor earnings. A financial market lender would never lend this representative family an amount that the family could not possibly pay back, even if it chose 0 consumption forever. So a natural lower bound on what borrowing could be for the family would be the natural debt limit, right? Negative W bar here, which depends on a sequence of R's and W's, right? Which we're assuming is a time invariant function of the state A. So the constraint correspondence just depends on A in that way. So you see how we've sort of, the problem looks a little bit different than the optimal growth model. You guys have any questions about how to interpret this?
How would you interpret in words with regards to the interval?
This interval?
In terms of the GA,
So this shows the menu of different possible choices that the representative family could choose for A prime. In any given period, it could choose, the maximum it could choose for A prime would be this upper limit, and that's if it chooses to consume nothing today. Or alternatively, the family could borrow, so the lower limit on A would be negative W bar. That's the natural debt limit. So any amount A between some huge negative number, the natural debt limit, and this positive upper bound is what they could choose for A prime.
that's different compared to the optimal growth where
The optimal growth model, there's no borrowing. It's a central planner that's dropping allocations. And so the only feasible set for the capital stock is between 0 and whatever the upper limit is if you assume no consumption. All right, how do we do this problem? We've set up the maximization problem. Let's now find the conditions that characterize the optimal choice. What's the derivative of the value function with respect to A prime, or the Bellman equation with respect to A prime? It's going to be negative 1 plus n times u prime of, let's just call it C, because I'm going to be lazy, plus beta v prime of A prime. That's equal to 0 at the optimal choice for A prime and correspondingly the optimal choice for consumption. What else do we need to characterize the solution or the optimal choice for the household here is a envelope condition. What is the derivative of the value function with respect to A? Well, that would be u prime of C evaluated at the optimal choice for A prime times what's the derivative of C with respect to A? Remember, we ignore the effects of A on R and W. The family doesn't consider how its choice affects those two factor prices. So this would be 1 plus R. we can take these two pieces of information now, scroll the scroll the envelope condition forward one period and plug it into the first order condition to derive an intertemporal Euler equation, which would be what? 1 plus n times u prime of c is equal to beta times v prime of a prime. Well, that looks to me like it would be u prime of c prime times 1 plus r prime. So, what would be the Euler equation then if we reinsert our time subscripts into this problem? 1 plus n, because ultimately we want to characterize the full competitive equilibrium. U prime of CT, well, that's 1 plus RT times AT plus WT minus 1 plus N AT plus 1. Is equal to beta. Now remember what beta is. It's 1 plus N over 1 plus rho in this model, right? Times U prime of CT plus 1. So that's 1 plus RT plus 1, AT plus 1, plus WT plus 1, minus 1 plus N AT plus 2. Times a 1 plus RT plus 1. This is the intertemporal Euler equation. Where, by the way, you can see here that the 1 plus n's cancel. And so what are we going to be left with? The marginal utility of consumption today is equal to the discounted value of the marginal utility of consumption tomorrow times the gross real interest rate. That should look very familiar to you. It's the same Euler equation that is generated in the other models we've talked about this semester. To characterize the solution to an infinite horizon optimization problem, we need to identify the intertemporal Euler equation, and we need to write down the transversality condition. What is the transversality condition here? You guys should be able to start generating these on your own. It's the limit as t goes to infinity of the discounted value of what? The marginal value of the state, right? So u prime 1 plus RT AT plus WT minus 1 plus N AT plus 1 times 1 plus RT AT is equal to 0.
We have a question real quick. Why is that CT plus 2? Is that 2?
Oh, that's not 2. I meant 1. Good eye. But this is Ben, this is AT plus 2 inside of CT plus 1.
Yeah,
Right, yeah.
I was just wondering because it's scrolling.
Okay, so, I think a compact way to describe the solution to the household's problem is a sequence of C's and A's that satisfy the intertemporal Euler equation, 1 plus n u prime of CT is equal to beta u prime of CT plus 1 times 1 plus RT plus 1. It also must satisfy the period by period budget constraint. And it also must satisfy the transversality condition. these three equations characterize the solution to the household's optimization problem for given sequences of WT, RT, and for a given initial value of wealth. Now, you might see here that, well, wait a minute. Don't we have to check to make sure this thing satisfies the no Ponzi constraint? Well, it turns out, and we'll do this in just a few minutes, that the transversality condition is going to imply that the no Ponzi constraint holds in strong form. So as long as the transversality condition is satisfied, which has to be the case if the household is behaving optimally, the no Ponzi game constraint will also be satisfied. Okay, any questions so far? All right. I'm going to take a look at the Euler equation here for a second. I want to focus on it for 1 minute and talk about what it implies about the path of consumption over time. If we divide both sides, recognizing first of all that beta is equal to 1 plus n over 1 plus rho, right? If we divide both sides of the Euler equation by 1 plus n, and we flip the terms around, what you're going to find is that u prime of ct plus 1 over u prime of ct is equal to simply 1 plus rho over 1 plus r t plus 1. Right? The Euler equation implies that the ratio of the marginal utility of consumption tomorrow to today is equal to the ratio of 1 plus rho, the discount rate, over the gross real return to assets. Well, this is the Euler equation, right? It implies certain behavior about the consumption profile over time, right? What if I told you that rho is exactly equal to RT plus 1? What does that imply about CT and CT plus 1? If rho is equal to R, then the right-hand side here is equal to 1. So what does that imply then about CT relative to CT plus 1? U is strictly increasing. So if U prime of CT plus 1 is equal to U prime of CT, then CT and CT plus 1 are the same. So if the return to assets is exactly equal to the time rate of preference, or the discount rate, then the representative family's consumption profile is going to be constant over time. The amount they consume today is going to be the same that they're going to want to consume tomorrow. What if I told you that RT plus 1 is bigger than rho? Then what happens to the right-hand side of this equation? It becomes less than 1, meaning that U prime of CT plus 1 is less than U prime of CT. Well, what does that imply about CT plus 1 relative to CT? The utility function is strictly concave. So if U prime of CT plus 1 is less than U prime of CT, that means CT plus 1 is bigger than CT. So if the real returns to assets exceed the time rate of preference, your consumption profile is growing over time. If RT plus 1 is less than rho, you get the exact opposite. Your consumption profile is shrinking over time. The remarkable feature about these results, which, by the way, go back and compare this to the OLG model. It is the same result. You have it in your notes. Is that we can say a lot about the slope of the consumption profile, the optimal consumption profile over time, without any reference to some very important quantities in the model. Number one, initial wealth. Who cares? That's not going to have any impact on determining what the growth rate of consumption is over time. The only thing that affects the growth rate of consumption over time is the real interest rate relative to the discount rate and whatever happens to be in the utility function, whatever parameters are part of the utility function. What else, strikingly, doesn't affect the growth rate of consumption over time? Your lifetime labor earnings. Again, who cares? How much you actually earn on the job has no bearing directly on what your consumption profile looks like over time. In other words, let's do a thought experiment here. Let's suppose, Ben, I tell you that we know what C0 is. So initial consumption is going to be given, okay? Then we can find C1 directly from the Euler equation, right? U prime of C1 would be equal to 1 plus rho over 1 plus R1 times U prime of C0, right? So if we know the utility function and I tell you what initial consumption is, we can get what first period consumption is going to be, assuming we also know the sequence of real interest rates over time. Now then, you can use this equation to find C1. Well, you can use the equation again to find C2, right? U prime of C2 is just 1 plus rho over 1 plus R2 times U prime of C1. You can do this repeatedly, and you would be able to find an entire history of C's from period 1 to infinity. So the entire time profile or slope of that consumption profile over time can be found just from the Euler equation without any reference to the initial wealth and your lifetime labor earnings. Now, that's not to say that these two things here are unimportant. They're not. They're extremely important. But what are they used for? For determining what? The Euler equation by itself determines C1 through C infinity.
So you just need to find C0.
C0, that's the initial value of consumption. That's not given in the problem. That is chosen optimally by the household. That choice for initial period consumption will depend on initial wealth and lifetime labor earnings. We're going to prove this later on, but what's going on here is that the representative family has some given value of initial assets at date 0. It chooses the optimal value of consumption in date 0, such that the subsequent path of consumption implied by the Euler equation will exhaust the family's lifetime budget constraint at infinity, which is to say, will satisfy the transversality condition. So initial consumption is really pinned down by the transversality condition, which depends critically on initial wealth and lifetime labor earnings. The subsequent path of consumption all the way to the steady state only depends on the Euler equation, which is independent of those two things. Does that make intuitive sense? Sort of. Okay. Let us now establish that the sequence of optimal asset holdings by the family satisfies the no Ponzi condition. We need to make sure that this is true. Otherwise, the family is going to have this incentive to want to generate negative infinite borrowing. The family's optimal sequence of asset holdings is characterized by two equations, the Euler equation and the transversality condition. Okay, so let's use those two pieces of information. Now, what does the Euler equation say? U prime of CT is equal to 1 plus rho over 1 plus RT times U prime of CT minus 1. All I've done is I've taken the Euler equation and I've scrolled it back one period, right? Well, that's equal to 1 plus rho over 1 plus RT. What's U prime of CT minus 1? That can be found by taking this first equation and scrolling it back a period. That's 1 plus rho over 1 plus RT minus 1, U prime of CT minus 2. Well, that's just 1 plus rho over 1 plus RT times 1 plus rho over 1 plus RT minus 1. U prime of CT minus 2 can be found by taking the original equation and scrolling it back 2 periods. So that's 1 plus rho over 1 plus RT minus 2 times U prime CT minus 3. You guys get the point. What happens if we take this all the way back to date 0? We're going to get that the marginal utility of consumption today is going to be equal to U prime of C0 times the product from J is equal to 1 to the little t of 1 plus rho over 1 plus Rj. No, not quite. Yes, that's right. All right, because we're going to go from, 1 plus rho over 1 plus R1 times 1 plus rho over 1 plus R2, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So I've used the Euler equation, let me just be clear here, in order to express the marginal utility of consumption today in terms of the optimal marginal utility of consumption at date 0 times this modified discount factor. Now, why do I want to do that? Let's take this information then and plug it into the transversality condition. What is the transversality condition? It says that the limit as t goes to infinity of beta to the t U prime of CT 1 plus RT AT is equal to 0, right? Well, let's start substituting in some of this information. This is the limit as t goes to infinity. What's beta to the t? That is 1 plus n over 1 plus rho raised to the t, right? What is u prime of ct? Well, we just found in this little iterative procedure above that it's u prime of c0 times the product from j is equal to 1 to t of 1 plus rho over 1 plus rj. And then what do we have left? A 1 plus RT times an AT. And again, because this is the transversality condition, the whole thing has to be equal to 0. I'm going to pull the u prime of C0 outside of the limit. And I'm also going to take this 1 plus rho outside of this product. And since there's t of them, I'm going to have a 1 plus rho to the t. And then I'll be left with a product that looks like the following: 1 over 1 plus R1, 1 over 1 plus R2, all the way to 1 over 1 plus RT. And then I can't forget my 1 plus RT times AT, all that's equal to 0. U prime of C0 is some positive number. So I can divide both sides of the equation, it's gone. I have a 1 plus rho to the t canceling with this 1 plus rho to the t. And I have a 1 plus RT canceling with a 1 plus RT. This becomes the limit as t goes to infinity then. Let me take the 1 plus n's and stick them into this product here.
How did you get rid of the U prime? Did you just divide it off?
Yeah, it's the whole thing's equal to 0, so you just, it goes away. Okay, so the U prime goes away, the 1 plus rho's to the t cancel. Now I'm going to take the 1 plus n to the t, and I'm going to stick it inside of this product. But because of the 1 plus RT cancels, I've only got t minus 1 of those terms, right? So one of the 1 plus n's is on the outside of the product. Now let me do one other trick here. I'm going to divide this whole thing by a 1 plus R0, all right, and multiply by a 1 plus R0. That doesn't change the limit expression at all, right? And then just like I did with U prime of C0, I can divide both sides by 1 plus R0 because that's just a constant. It's a positive number. And so what am I left with? I'm left with a limit as t goes to infinity. Now I can combine this first 1 plus n term with the rest, and it's AT times the product from j is equal to 0 to little t minus 1 of 1 plus n over 1 plus rj, and the whole thing's equal to 0. Isn't that cool? That is the no-Ponzi constraint in strong form. The transversality condition, which is an optimality condition in the model, implies that the no-Ponzi constraint is going to hold in strong form. Make sure you guys understand that distinction, okay? I know I've emphasized this over and over again, but I want to make sure this is clear to you. We imposed on the household's optimization problem the weak form of the no-Ponzi condition to rule out this infinite borrowing business. The transversality condition is one of the key optimality conditions of the model. It characterizes the household's optimal plan. That transversality condition implies in turn that the no-Ponzi constraint will actually hold in strong form as an equality. And what we've already seen from the last class is that the no-Ponzi condition in strong form is exactly says the same thing that the family's lifetime budget constraint binds. That the present value of lifetime consumption is exactly equal to initial wealth plus the present value of lifetime labor income. All of that should be intuitively clear to you, right? That if a family is behaving optimally, it's going to want to exhaust its lifetime resources in order to maximize its stream of consumption over time. That is, make the lifetime budget constraint bind. The transversality condition is the optimality condition in the model that makes that so. Does that make sense? So, I know I talked about the transversality condition a lot over the last few weeks, and it probably wasn't clear as to why this stupid limit expression was all that important for anything. You know, we don't really use it when we find the optimal policy function, right? It's just something we attach to the end of the problem when we characterize the equilibrium. And that's true, but it's very, very important because the transversality condition is the condition in the model that guarantees that the family's lifetime budget constraint is going to bind. And what we'll show in the next, not the next class, but the class after that, when we characterize the saddle path solution in this model, which demonstrates how the consumption in the capital stock transition to the steady state in the long run, that transversality condition is going to be called upon in order to establish the existence and uniqueness of that transition path to the steady state, a unique equilibrium. So it is actually perhaps the most important equilibrium concept in the model in that sense. Just a few more words about this strong form of the no Ponzi condition. So we know that in equilibrium, the household's asset position is going to be equal to the capital stock in the economy. And so what's going to happen in an equilibrium is that the limit then as t approaches infinity of kt times this kind of modified discount factor should be equal to 0. So the capital stock, the present value of the capital stock way out at infinity in terms of date t dollars or date t utility should be equal to 0. So the capital stock should, in present value terms, asymptotically approach 0. How can we make some sense out of this? Let's suppose that in this model, and it will turn out to be the case, that the limit as t approaches infinity of RT is going to be equal to R star. In other words, the real return to capital is going to converge to some steady state fixed point, which will be less than infinity. Okay? When provided that the capital stock itself does not converge to 0, which we know it's not, in the long run, the capital stock is going to converge to some steady state K star that we identified in the optimal growth model. The only way for this condition to be satisfied is if what? Is if R star happens to be bigger than N in the long run. You guys recognize this inequality?
Dynamic inefficiency.
Sorry?
Dynamic inefficiency.
Dynamic inefficiency. That's right. So if well, to be clear to Boyd, dynamic inefficiency would be the case in which R star is less than N, right? That is, the capital stock has accumulated to a point where the marginal product of capital is low enough and less than N. So what I guess what I'm trying to say to Boyd is that in this model, in order for the transversality condition to be satisfied, or the no Ponzi condition, strong form to be satisfied, it's good. These dynamically inefficient outcomes are going to be ruled out, right? In the steady state, we're going to have the real interest rate exceeding the population growth rate, right? Think about it. What does the lifetime budget constraint look like here? The sum from 0 to infinity, the product from j is equal to 0 to little t of 1 plus n over 1 plus rj times ct, so that's the present discounted value of lifetime consumption, has to be less than or equal to initial wealth times 1 plus n, plus the present discounted value of lifetime labor earnings. Right? If R star Tavoy is less than N, if we have a dynamically inefficient economy, then this discount factor in the long run becomes greater than 1. And what happens to the right-hand side? The whole thing shoots off to infinity, and we have a problem where the household can generate infinite consumption. Doesn't make any sense, right? So what we're going to have in optimality is, in order for the transversality condition to hold, it must be true, because we know K star is not 0. It must be true that R star is bigger than N in the long run, which means that we avoid this kind of dynamic inefficiency that we saw could emerge in the OLG model. And in that case, you won't have infinite resources here. You'll have only finite resources, and therefore a finite stream of consumption. So that's one thing I do want to point out, is that in the OLG model, the pecuniary externalities present in that model, which give rise to this possibility for households to over-accumulate capital, can lead to dynamic inefficiency. And we talked about how there were certain fiscal policies that we could implement that would unwind those distortions and bring us back to something like the golden rule. In the neoclassical growth model, those dynamic inefficiencies are going to be ruled out in equilibrium because they would violate the transversality condition, or the strong form of the no Ponzi condition. So we don't have to worry about the possibility of dynamic inefficiency. Okay, any questions then about that? Let's finish today by doing a formal statement then of the full competitive equilibrium of the model, okay? So a decentralized and I'll say stationary competitive equilibrium in the neoclassical growth model would correspond to a sequence. And I'll just do this in the most general way possible. I think I present it somewhat differently in the slides, so just be aware, in the lecture notes, but just be aware of that. It's a sequence of consumption, asset holdings, let's say real wages, real returns to assets, rental rates, and capital per worker. We can even put output per worker in here if we want. That satisfy the following conditions. One would be the firm's optimality conditions. So RT is equal to F prime of KT. Another would be the real wage equaling the marginal product of capital. We also have a system of equations that characterize household optimality, right? One would be its Euler equation. So U prime of CT is equal to 1 over 1 plus rho U prime of CT plus 1 times 1 plus RT plus 1. Another would be the period by period budget constraint, which says that CT is equal to 1 plus RT AT plus WT minus 1 plus N times AT plus 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I need 7 equations. I've got 4 so far. What am I missing? So I've got the Euler equation. I've got the period by period budget constraint. I've got the firm's optimality conditions. we need some market clearing conditions, right? The rental rate on capital should be equal to the real return to capital plus the depreciation rate, or little r is equal to big R minus delta. What other market clearing conditions do we need? The family's asset holdings, A, must be equal to the capital stock for all T. And I guess I'm lacking one, right? What would be the value of Y? Simply equal to f of kt. So here we have 7 equations that characterize these 7 variables. And what is given in the problem? A0 is equal to K0 is given. Now, technically speaking, we need to have one more condition at infinity, right? And that is either the transversality condition, or alternatively, we can write it in terms of the strong form of the no Ponzi condition, because we saw today that those two pieces of information are two sides of the same coin. So that's the limit as kt or at goes to infinity, either one of the product from j is equal to 0 to little t minus 1 of 1 plus n over 1 plus rj. That is equal to 0. That would be a full statement of the competitive stationary equilibrium. I say stationary because it's written in terms of variables that have a stationary fixed point in the steady state. Now, there are multiple ways to write the equilibrium. Some of you have raised these points before. You can shrink the dimension of this by substituting, for instance, A out of the problem, right? I can put in, for all values of A here, I can stick the capital stock in there and get rid of that variable, right? And therefore you get rid of equation 6. We don't have to have Y's in here as well, so I can get rid of that one. I could end up getting rid of capital R, right? And you, in fact, you can shrink it down to as few as, I believe, 2 equations, or maybe even 1 equation over just CT and KT, right? As long as you also keep the Ponzi, no Ponzi condition. The point when you're writing, what I'm trying to say is when you're writing your definition of a competitive equilibrium, you need to have the number of unknowns that characterize the equilibrium equaling the number of equations, okay? But you don't have to put all of these in here. The main ones are consumption and capital, right? And but the issue here is that in order to do that, you would have to substitute the R's, W's, and A's out of these equations by using the other equations, by reducing the dimensionality of the problem. Okay? All right, I'm going to stop there today, and let me tell you what the plan for the next class is. So one thing we want to establish is the equivalency in the allocations between this model and the optimal growth model. You probably already realize this, but there are no frictions or distortions or asymmetries of information or anything funny going on in this model that would prevent the fundamental welfare theorems of microeconomics from applying. So in that frictionless world, a decentralized competitive equilibrium can be, a Pareto optimal equilibrium can be supported as a competitive equilibrium. In other words, the social planner's solution should correspond to the competitive solutions. That's the first thing we want to establish is in the next class is to show that the optimal growth model we did last week ends up generating the same solutions as the neoclassical growth model. We did that from the perspective of a benevolent central planner. We've looked at this model from the perspective of competitive markets, okay? So that's proposition 1, and we will prove that. It's a straightforward proof. We need to show that the Euler equation in the optimal growth model is equivalent to the Euler equation here. We need to show that the transversality condition in the optimal growth model is equivalent to the no Ponzi condition here. Once we establish that, then we know that the allocations are going to be the same. Then we can talk briefly about the steady state, but I don't have to talk very long about that, right? Because if the allocations are the same, the steady state is going to be the same as the optimal growth model. We can do a few comparative static exercises. I'm probably just going to do graphical versions of those and let you guys do the partial derivatives on your own. And then we'll really be, at that point, we'll be able to start our talk about the transition dynamics in this model. How is it that this economy converges to the steady state in the long run? We know the steady state's unique. It's the same steady state that's in the optimal growth model. That steady state is also monotonically convergent, so this one should be as well. But in order to characterize those dynamics, we want to introduce some new concepts. One is a phase diagram, which is needed to talk about the dynamics of a model that has states and co-states, like consumption and capital. And then we want to derive this thing called the saddle path solution, which is that monotonically convergent path that I'm speaking of, and prove the existence and uniqueness of it. That should take at least 2 more class periods, is my guess. We possibly bleed into a third, I don't know. The proof of that last thing is a little bit involved. And then we'll be done with this. So look, your next test is coming kind of on the horizon here. At this point, you need to be comfortable with the basic dynamic programming theorems and how to take sequence problems and set them up as a recursive problem, and be practicing the solving for the policy functions in that class of dynamic programming problems that have analytical solutions. And then at this point, you also, I think, need to be pretty solidly familiar with the optimal growth model. All right, so over the next couple of weeks, you can really understand kind of the mechanics and the intuition of what's going on in the neoclassical model. Your next exam will have 2 problems on there. One will be, I can promise you, will be some application of dynamic programming, in the sense that I'll give you a sequence problem. I'll ask you to set up the Bellman equation. I'll ask you to characterize the solution, and you'll have to use a method of undetermined coefficients, guess and verify strategy to identify the policy function and or the value function. That will be on your exam, 100%. There will also be some question on your exam regarding the neoclassical growth model that is going to involve phase diagrams and whatnot, okay? So nothing out of completely left field here.
So are we still planning for that exam to be 2 weeks from this Friday?
If I can get through